The stars stretched out across the cold expanse of space as the Endeavour glided through the quiet void. Captain Jackson Rhett stood in the command room, staring out at the darkness. His crew was a mix of seasoned veterans and green recruits, each with their own reason for embarking on this perilous mission. They'd been tasked with a routine exploration, the kind of job that wouldn't stir any excitement. At least that's what they thought. But the coordinates they had intercepted were anything but ordinary. The ancient coordinates had led them to an uncharted system, one that hadn't been marked on any star maps. After weeks of scanning, Jackson's crew found an anomaly, a small, seemingly lifeless planet hidden in the depths of a nebula, its surface obscured by a dense atmosphere. This was where they were meant to land. The mission had been assigned under the guise of a simple survey, but deep down, Jackson could feel it, the pull of something greater, something forgotten. As the Endeavour descended into the planet's atmosphere, the air was thick with tension. The crew worked in silence, their eyes glued to the holographic screens as they passed through dense clouds of green gas. Jackson could hear his second-in-command, Lieutenant Kara O'Donnell, murmuring to herself as she adjusted the ship's descent parameters. She was an experienced officer, but even she seemed unsettled by the unknown. "Captain," Kira said, her voice tight, "I'm getting strange readings from the surface. It's like there's an energy field around the planet. It's almost like it's shielding itself." Jackson turned to face her. "What do you mean, shielding itself?" "I don't know," she replied, eyes scanning the data frantically. "It's like the planet is hiding something. Something big. We're not supposed to be here." "That's exactly why we're here," Jackson replied with a grin that barely concealed his unease. "Set a course for the surface. Let's see what we find." The landing was rough. The planet's atmosphere didn't make it easy, but the Endeavour settled in a clearing after a tense few moments. The crew quickly donned their gear and prepared to investigate. The air smelled of sulfur and decay, and the ground was uneven, littered with strange metallic remnants half buried beneath thick foliage. "We're not the first ones to be here," said Dr. Melina Voss, the ship's archaeologist, as she kneeled to examine a fragment of what appeared to be ancient metal covered in unfamiliar symbols. Her fingers traced the symbols, sending an unsettling shiver through her. This is humanity's lost legacy." Jackson's curiosity grew. "How can you be sure?" "The architecture. These markings. This style of construction. It's ancient, much older than anything we've ever encountered. It's human, and it's unmistakable." Her voice faltered as she stood. "This was once ours." The crew pressed on, following a faint trail through the dense, jungle-like environment, cutting through vines and trees as they made their way toward the ruins that had first caught their attention. They came upon a massive stone structure, its surface covered in strange growths, yet the shape was undeniably that of a throne room. Massive pillars stretched up into the canopy, their once ornate carvings now worn by time, but still regal in their form. But it wasn't the architecture that drew their attention. It was what lay beyond the entrance. The throne room itself seemed to be alive with energy. A massive throne, black as obsidian, sat atop a raised platform. It was covered in ancient symbols that pulsed with an eerie light, like the last remnants of a forgotten dynasty calling out across the centuries. Jackson stepped forward, his hand hovering over the stone seat. Something, an unexplainable force, drew him closer. He could almost hear whispers, faint murmurs carried on the wind. What is this?" Kira whispered, staring in awe. "Humanity's throne," Dr. Voss said, breathless. "And I think it's waiting for us." Before anyone could respond, the ground trembled, a low hum vibrating through the stone beneath them. The air thickened, and the crew instinctively reached for their weapons. The forgotten relic had not been so easily discovered. It had been waiting. And now, it had awakened. The ground trembled again, this time with more force. The Endeavour's crew exchanged uneasy glances, hands instinctively gripping their weapons. The air around the throne pulsed with an energy that felt like a heartbeat, rhythmic and steady. A low, mechanical hum filled the atmosphere, rising in pitch, and the ancient walls of the throne room seemed to respond, their intricate carvings shifting slightly as if they were alive. Jackson took a hesitant step forward, his boots echoing in the silent room. The throne, black as night, adorned with strange markings, was the source of the disturbance. It stood alone at the far end of the chamber, a symbol of forgotten power that seemed to demand reverence. The hum intensified, and something in the room seemed to stir, as though the throne itself was awakening after millennia of slumber. "Captain, I don't like this," Kira muttered under her breath, her eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of a threat. Jackson's gaze remained fixed on the throne. "Stay sharp, everyone. Dr. Voss, what do you make of it?" Dr. Voss was absorbed in the strange symbols etched into the throne's surface. "This technology is beyond anything I've ever encountered. These are human designs, but they're far more advanced than anything from our time. It's almost as though they were." She stopped abruptly, her voice faltering. "No, that's not possible." "What?" Jackson asked, stepping closer. "I've seen these symbols before," Dr. Voss said, almost to herself, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Not on Earth, not in any historical archives, but in data we recovered from the ancient AI archives on Mars. She paused, realizing how absurd it sounded. "They look like the markings of a long-lost imperial dynasty, one that supposedly disappeared before humanity's first interstellar expansions." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The implications were staggering. So this could be an artifact from that era. "Not just an artifact," Dr. Voss replied, her voice trembling with excitement. "A relic, a piece of technology left behind by a civilization that predates all known history. And this throne is something more than we've imagined." Before anyone could respond, the humming sound rose to a deafening crescendo. The walls around them began to glow, faint blue lights flickering to life, like veins coursing with electricity. The throne's surface rippled, and for a brief moment, it looked like the air around it was warping, as though reality itself was bending. Suddenly, a harsh voice boomed through the chamber, deep and metallic, reverberating from the walls as though they themselves were speaking. "Who dares to disturb the sovereign's seat?" The voice sent a chill down the crew's spines. It wasn't just a voice. It felt like the planet itself was speaking, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The crew instinctively stepped back, weapons raised, but there was nowhere to hide. "We seek knowledge," Jackson called out, his voice steadied despite the rising panic. "We come in peace. We are explorers, not conquerors." "Explorers." The voice laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed like a thunderclap. "You trespass in a domain long forgotten. You awaken what should have remained lost." Dr. Voss took a cautious step forward. "Please, we mean no harm. We're trying to understand." "Understand." The voice cut her off. "You seek to claim what you do not comprehend. This throne is not for your kind. It is a symbol of a power that crushed worlds and forged empires. It is not a seat for the weak." The ground shuddered violently beneath their feet, sending the crew scrambling to stay upright. The throne's surface shimmered with an eerie blue light, and from it, a figure materialized, a holographic projection of a man, regal and imposing, dressed in an ancient suit of armor. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his presence radiated authority. "You are not worthy," the figure declared, his voice chilling. "But you will be tested." The figure raised a hand, and the room around them began to change. The air thickened, becoming heavy with an oppressive weight. The crew's surroundings distorted, shifting into something different, something hostile. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the walls began to close in, forcing them to act. Jackson gritted his teeth, determination filling his chest. "We're not here to destroy anything. We're here to learn." to understand the past. The figure's eyes locked onto him, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. Then you will face the trials of the Sovereign, prove your worth, or be consumed by the legacy you awaken. With a flick of the hologram's wrist, the room erupted into chaos. The walls shifted again, creating new obstacles, new dangers. The throne had awakened, and it was no longer just a relic. It was a test. The crew of the Endeavor had no choice but to confront whatever the throne would throw at them. And they had no idea just how dangerous the trials would be. The room shifted violently, the walls grinding against each other with a mechanical shriek as the once stable ground cracked and trembled beneath their feet. The crew of the Endeavor found themselves in the midst of an ever-changing nightmare. As the holographic figure of the ancient sovereign flickered and moved, the entire room seemed to pulse with energy. It was clear now. This was not just a relic. This throne, this entire chamber, was an active, sentient entity, alive with the power of a long-lost civilization. Jackson's breath quickened. "Brace yourselves," he shouted, but his words were drowned by the rising cacophony of shifting metal and thrumming energy. His eyes darted around as the walls closed in, the ceiling beginning to descend toward them. "Get to cover." The crew scrambled, diving behind the stone pillars that lined the throne room, trying to shield themselves from the collapsing architecture. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. It was no use. They had awoken something far beyond their understanding. The throne wasn't just an artifact. It was a weapon, a prison, and now it was testing them. "Look," shouted Lieutenant Kira, pointing to the throne. The figure of the ancient ruler flickered again, its eyes narrowing as it spoke. "Only those worthy of the Sovereign's throne may leave this place alive. Prove your worth, or be consumed by your own arrogance." Jackson's eyes narrowed. There was no turning back now. He knew the fate of his crew depended on understanding the trials ahead. But there was something else gnawing at him, something deeper than fear. A presence, a pull seemed to come from the throne itself. It was as if it was calling to him, beckoning him closer, whispering promises of unimaginable power. "Captain," Dr. Voss said, her voice trembling, "this technology, it's not just an artifact. It's a judgment. The throne was designed to test the rulers of the Empire, those who dared claim dominion over the galaxy. But it's more than that. The trials are not just physical. They're moral. The Sovereign's judgment is based on character, on worthiness. If you fail, there's no second chance." Jackson swallowed hard, fighting the magnetic pull of the throne. "We'll face whatever it throws at us, together." But then, something unexpected happened. A soft beep came from the control panel at the side of the room. The crew froze, their eyes locked on the display. On the screen appeared an ancient symbol, a sigil that was unmistakably human, but one that none of them had seen before. It was a strange, cryptic mark that seemed to glow, shifting between blue and gold, as if it were alive. "What is that?" Kiera asked, her voice tense. "It's a signal," Dr. Voss murmured. "But this isn't from Earth. This signal, it's from someone who came before us." The figure of the Sovereign flickered again, its face now taking on a more ominous expression. "Ah, you seek to understand the throne's power, to claim dominion over what was never meant to be yours. But before you do, know this: the blood of the Sovereign flows through your veins, whether you accept it or not." Jackson's eyes widened. The blood of the Sovereign. The word seemed to pierce through him like a blade. The pull to the throne was stronger now, a voice inside his mind urging him forward. Dr. Voss gasped. "Wait, Jackson, you need to listen. There's something here I haven't told you." She glanced around nervously, as if ensuring no one else could hear. "There's a reason you were chosen for this mission. The throne, it reacts to certain bloodlines, and you're more connected to it than you realize. I've traced some of your lineage, and there's a connection to this lost dynasty. You heir." Before she could finish, the ground beneath them heaved once more. The room split open, and a series of holographic barriers rose up, encircling the crew in tight sectors. A surge of energy from the throne sent a blinding light across the chamber, and a deep, resounding voice echoed again. "Prove your worth, sovereign heir. Fail, and your bloodline shall be erased." Jackson's mind raced. He hadn't been prepared for this, not for any of it. He thought this mission was about discovery, about exploration. But now, it was clear. The throne was more than a relic. It was a judge, and it had already passed its sentence. "You have to decide, Captain," Kira said, stepping forward. Her voice was shaky, but there was a determination in her eyes. "Are you going to claim it? The throne. It's yours, isn't it?" Jackson looked at the throne, then back at his crew. The choice was clear, but it was more than just a simple act of power. The legacy of humanity was intertwined with this place, with the throne. Could he really accept what it demanded of him? Could he risk unleashing the full force of an empire long gone? But as the sovereign's voice rang out, Jackson made his decision. "It's not just about power," he said, his voice steady. "We're here to prove we can learn from the past, not repeat it." With a deep breath, he stepped forward, ready to face the trials of the throne, knowing that whatever came next, it would change everything. Jackson stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the throne's legacy pressed heavily on his mind, but he wasn't about to turn back. His crew had followed him this far, and the trials of the throne were inevitable. He had no choice but to face them head-on. As he took another step, the floor beneath him seemed to give way, and he dropped to one knee. A surge of energy flooded through the room, momentarily blinding him. The walls shimmered with unnatural light, and the throne's pulsing glow intensified. The figure of the ancient sovereign appeared once more, its eyes now glowing with a fierce, almost predatory light. "Only the chosen may ascend," the figure intoned. "Only the worthy may claim dominion." The room around Jackson shifted again, the space between him and the throne growing more immense. It was as though the chamber was expanding, forcing him to prove his resolve. The other members of the crew watched in silence, their weapons at the ready, knowing that the trials had begun. But something in the air felt wrong. "I'll do it," Jackson muttered to himself, barely audible over the mounting hum. "I'll face it." The sovereign's figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. "So be it, heir of the forgotten dynasty." But just as Jackson prepared to step toward the throne, a sharp noise pierced the tense silence. It was a soft, almost imperceptible click, followed by a whirring sound, the unmistakable noise of a weapon system powering up. He spun around just in time to see Dr. Melina Voss raise her weapon, the barrel aimed directly at him. The look in her eyes wasn't one of fear or confusion. It was something colder, something far more calculated. The familiar warmth and trust he had once felt for her were gone, replaced by an icy determination. "Melina, what are you doing?" Jackson's voice was low but firm, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. "I'm sorry, Captain," she said, her voice eerily calm. "But you don't understand. This throne isn't meant to be claimed. You think the trials are just a test of worth. They're a test of loyalty, to the throne, to the empire, to humanity's true legacy. You've all been lied to." Jackson felt a shock run through him. "What are you talking about?" Melina's expression hardened. "I didn't want to do this, but it's the only way. This throne is a weapon, yes, but more importantly, it's a key. The power it holds. This isn't meant to be wielded by anyone who calls themselves human. I've been studying the archives, Jackson. The empire was corrupted, destroyed by the very same ideals you're about to embrace. It's not a throne of leadership. It's a throne of control. And if you claim it, it will be the end of us all." Jackson's mind reeled. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The trials, the power. It all seemed so clear before. But now, Melina's words made him question everything. His eyes darted to the rest of the crew. Kira's face was a mask of disbelief, but the others, his team, his friends, looked torn. Some were nervous, others confused, and one or two seemed strangely resigned. "Melina, you can't be serious," Jackson said, his voice rising. "The throne is humanity's legacy. It's our right to reclaim it, to rebuild what was lost." "No, Jackson." Melina's voice shook with a dangerous certainty. "It's not our right. It's our doom." She didn't give him a chance to respond. In one swift motion, she activated a hidden panel on her weapon. The hum of energy intensified, and the barrel shifted. A pulse of brilliant light shot toward Jackson, who barely managed to duck in time, the blast grazing his shoulder and searing through the air with a blistering heat. The room erupted into chaos. Jackson scrambled to his feet, pain flaring from his shoulder, but adrenaline pushed him forward. "Everyone, get back. Melina's gone rogue." Kiera and the rest of the crew hesitated, glancing between Jackson and Melina. A few of them looked to the captain for guidance, but others, those closest to Dr. Voss, were already edging away, confusion clouding their judgment. Melina's influence was subtle, like a poison seeping into their minds. "I didn't want this," Melina said, her voice breaking with an edge of sorrow. "But I will do whatever it takes to stop you from making the same mistake the old empire did." Before Jackson could respond, the floor beneath their feet shifted once more. The throne room's walls seemed to pulse with an angry energy, and the air became thick with tension. A low growl reverberated through the stone, almost as though the throne itself was reacting to the betrayal, to the division among the crew. The trials, it seemed, had just begun in earnest. Jackson's mind raced. The situation was spiraling out of control, but he couldn't afford to let the crew fall apart. They had a choice. Together, they could rise to meet the throne's trials, or they could fracture and destroy everything they'd worked for. As the room continued to shift and warp around them, Jackson knew one thing for certain. They were no longer just fighting for knowledge or power. They were fighting for their very survival. The battle for control erupted in an instant. Melina's betrayal shattered the fragile unity that had held the crew together. The air grew thick with tension as Jackson and his team tried to process what had just happened. His shoulder burned from the near miss of Melina's energy blast, but he didn't have time to dwell on the pain. The throne was still pulsing with a low, menacing hum, as if it was watching their every move, eager to see who would bend to its will. Jackson's eyes locked on Melina. Her expression was resolute, her weapon aimed squarely at him. There was no sign of hesitation, no sign of doubt in her stance. She was willing to destroy everything to prevent him from claiming the throne. "You don't understand, Jackson," Melina said, her voice shaking but firm. "This isn't just about the throne. It's about humanity's future. If you take its power, you'll doom us all. You'll enslave us, just like the empire that built it." "I don't believe that," Jackson snapped, taking a step forward despite the agony in his shoulder. "We're not here to dominate. We're here to learn from the past, to build something better." "No," she responded bitterly. "You're blind to what it really is. You're following in the footsteps of those who destroyed everything. The throne was their tool of control, and now you're going to make the same mistakes." The tension between them felt suffocating, but it wasn't just between Jackson and Melina. The crew was split. Some were eyeing Melina's weapon with suspicion. Others were caught in her words, unsure of which side to choose. They had come together as a team, but now they were divided, torn between loyalty to their captain and the fears planted by Melina's warnings. "Jackson, we have to stop her," Kira shouted, her voice strained. "We can't let this spiral into madness. We need to focus." Jackson glanced at Kira, his eyes flickering with pain. She was right. This wasn't just about him and Melina anymore. The entire crew was at risk. The throne's trials had already begun, and they had to pull together if they were going to survive whatever came next. He raised his hands, signaling the crew to stand down. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice commanding attention. "This isn't just about claiming power. It's about surviving this. We have to work together, no matter what. We can't let this throne divide us. We're humanity's last hope. And if we fail, everything will be lost. Trust me, I won't let it control us." Melina's eyes flickered with anger. "You're naive. It's already controlling you." Jackson took another step forward, slowly moving toward the throne. The light in the room seemed to dim, and the walls vibrated with an ominous energy, as if the throne itself was judging him. The ancient sovereign's voice boomed once again. "Test 1. The trial of unity. If you cannot stand as one, you will fall. Prove your loyalty, prove your worth, or face the consequences." The air grew heavier. A dark shadow seemed to stretch across the room, and the ground beneath them cracked open. From the fissures emerged towering, shifting forms. Tall, humanoid figures made of stone, their eyes glowing with the same blue energy as the throne. The trials had begun in earnest. "Get ready," Jackson barked, drawing his sidearm. The crew immediately fell into formation, their weapons raised. But despite the preparation, a deep sense of dread filled the room. They had no idea what these creatures were or what their true purpose was. But one thing was certain: their survival depended on their unity. The stone warriors began to move, their steps slow but purposeful. The energy in the room surged, and Jackson could feel the weight of the trial bearing down on him. He glanced over at Kira, who was scanning the approaching figures, and then to Dr. Voss, who seemed lost in thought. "We can't defeat them alone," Jackson said, his voice steady. "We need to work together. Use the environment. Stay close. Watch each other's backs." But as the stone creatures approached, Jackson saw that not everyone was on the same page. Some of the crew were still hesitant, unsure of which side to trust. Their divided loyalty was becoming a liability. In the blink of an eye, one of the stone figures lunged forward, swiping at Kira. She ducked just in time, rolling away, but the creature's massive hand grazed her side, sending her sprawling to the ground. "Kira," Jackson shouted, rushing toward her, but another creature was already moving in on him. The crew reacted quickly, but the hesitation was palpable. They weren't in sync. Some shot at the creatures, others hesitated, and others stood frozen. The trial was clear. The throne demanded unity. If they couldn't overcome their differences, they would fail. Jackson blocked a swing from one of the creatures and returned fire, taking out its knee joint. It staggered but didn't fall. He glanced back at his crew, frustration building. This wasn't a fight they could win through brute force. They had to trust each other. No, rely on each other. The throne had already manipulated their doubt. Now, it was playing on their fear. "Focus. We need to move as one. We survive as one," Jackson shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Get to Kira. Now, we fight together, or we all die." At that moment, something shifted. The crew began to move in unison. Kira, bloodied but determined, rolled to her feet. Dr. Voss fired a well-placed shot, taking down one of the stone figures with a precise hit to its core. The crew rallied, coordinating their movements and striking together, each covering the other. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time since the betrayal, the crew began to feel like a team again. The throne's pulsing light dimmed, and the creatures slowly withdrew, their forms melting back into the cracks in the floor. The trial was over for now. But Jackson knew this was just the beginning. The throne's power had been tested, and their unity had been tested. They had survived. For now. And yet, as he looked at his crew, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that there were more trials to come. Trials that would push them beyond their limits. Trials that would demand even more than unity. The room fell into an uneasy silence after the stone creatures disappeared back into the cracks in the floor. Jackson's breath came in shallow gasps, his body covered in sweat, and Kira's side was visibly bruised, though she had shaken off the worst of the injury. The crew was still on edge, their weapons raised and scanning the space for more threats. The throne remained where it had always been, its pulsing light now faint, like a distant heartbeat, watching them all. Jackson took a moment to catch his breath, his mind racing. The trial had been a success in the most immediate sense. The crew had pulled together, relying on each other in the heat of battle. But Melina's betrayal was still fresh in his mind. Despite the trial, despite their survival, something inside him gnawed at him. What if Melina was right? What if claiming the throne wasn't the key to rebuilding humanity, but its ultimate undoing? He shook his head, trying to push the doubt from his mind. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself now, not when the stakes were so high. They had come this far. There was no turning back. "Captain." Kiera's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone tight with worry. "We can't just stand around. This place, it's not going to give up easily. The throne, it's waiting for us to fail. We need to move." Jackson nodded, his gaze drifting to the throne. Its presence was oppressive, almost as if it was alive, sensing their hesitation. He had no choice but to push forward. "Let's move," he said, his voice steady. "But stay sharp. Melina, I don't know if we can trust her anymore, but we can't let her tear us apart." Dr. Voss stepped forward, eyes still narrowed in thought. She didn't seem quite as physically shaken as the rest of the crew, but the turmoil inside her was clear. She hadn't spoken a word since the battle, and Jackson knew she had to be grappling with the consequences of her actions. "Jackson," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading. "I know you're angry, but this isn't about me. It's about what's coming. The throne isn't just a tool. It's a doorway to something much worse. I've seen the records, Jackson. I've seen what happens when the throne's power is unlocked. It was never meant to be used. Not by anyone." He turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why keep this from us? Why sabotage the mission?" She flinched at the harshness in his voice, but her resolve remained. "Because I didn't want you to hate me. I didn't want anyone to think I was." Her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard before continuing. "I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to betray humanity, but I'm trying to protect you all from the same fate. The throne's power, it's tied to the darkest chapters of human history. You think it's a means to an end, but it's more like a cancer. It will consume everything you love." Jackson clenched his fists, staring at the throne. Was she right? Had they truly stumbled upon a force so ancient, so dark, that even humanity's strongest ideals couldn't overcome it? Before he could respond, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The throne's light flared once more, and the ground shook as if the very foundations of the room were being tested. Jackson's instincts flared. Something was coming. The air grew cold. An unnatural chill settled over the room, and shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the floor. From the walls, figures began to emerge. Ghostly apparitions, their forms translucent but their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace, their silent footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "The souls of the fallen," Dr. Voss whispered, her voice trembling. "The ones who failed the throne's trial long ago. Their spirits are bound here, cursed to guard it." Jackson's pulse quickened. "What do we do? How do we fight them?" "They are not physical," Dr. Voss said, her voice tight. "You can't destroy them with conventional weapons. The only way to stop them is to prove your strength of will. You have to overcome the guilt, the fear, the darkness that haunts you. They feed on it." Jackson clenched his fists. He had faced fear before. He had led his crew through battlefields, treacherous landscapes, and hostile encounters. But this was something different. These spirits weren't just enemies to be defeated. They were manifestations of the past, of failures, of regrets that transcended time. As the shadows closed in, their eyes burning through the dark, Jackson felt his own fears begin to surface. Memories from his past, of friends lost, of mistakes made, of choices that haunted him, began to surface in his mind. For a moment, he almost faltered. His resolve wavered. Then, through the darkness, Kira's voice cut through. "We're not alone in this, Jackson. We're a team. Together we can face this." Her words brought him back. He had come this far with his crew, and he wasn't going to let these shadows tear them apart now. The crew stood shoulder to shoulder, weapons lowered for now, as they faced the ghosts of humanity's past. The spirits loomed closer, their eyes piercing through their very souls. But Jackson stood tall. If this was the next trial, then they would meet it head-on, together. The throne watched in silence, its power pulsing with ominous expectation. The trial of the past had begun. The spirits closed in, their eyes glowing with the haunting light of those who had once failed the throne's trials. Their forms were shifting, amorphous, but their presence was suffocating, a weight in the air that seemed to press down on the crew's chest. Jackson could feel his breath hitching in his throat as the shadows danced toward them, their movements fluid, as though they had no fixed form at all. Kira stood beside him, her weapon lowered but ready. Despite the terror that crept into her eyes, she remained steady. He could feel the same strength emanating from her as he did from the others. Desperation and determination mixed with the same resolve to fight for something bigger than themselves. "You have to face your past," a whisper echoed through the room, a voice that seemed to come from all around them, the ethereal words seeping into Jackson's mind like cold fingers. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't external. It was inside his mind. An intrusion, a question. The spirits circled them now, closer than before. The cold they carried seeped into his bones, and suddenly, the weight of his past mistakes, his doubts, and his fears crashed down on him. He could see them, visions of people he had lost. Friends, family, loved ones he had abandoned or failed to protect. He could hear their voices calling his name, accusing him, demanding to know why he had failed them. The whispers filled his mind, a storm of regret that twisted his stomach into knots. He saw his younger self, eager and full of idealism, before the crushing weight of command, before the battlefields and decisions that had torn at his soul. "Jackson." Kira's voice broke through, bringing him back to the present. "You're not alone. We're in this together." She reached for his hand, steadying him. For a moment, the room seemed to shift. The darkness that had clouded his vision began to recede, and the overwhelming voices of the past quieted. The trial wasn't about fighting the spirits physically. It was about facing the weight of everything that had brought him here. The failures, the choices that had made him question whether he deserved to lead this crew, whether he even deserved to claim the throne. The spirits were not just a force to defeat. They were a reflection of his own inner turmoil. To move forward, he had to confront them, not with violence, but with strength of heart. "Do not fear," Kira said, her voice like a beacon in the darkness. "You've led us through so much already. We've come this far because of you. Now face this. Face your own heart. We all have our ghosts, but together, we will fight through them." Her words were enough to shatter the cloud of guilt that had formed around him. Jackson took a deep breath and focused. The whispers around him grew quieter, the shadowy figures still swirling. But now, Jackson was clear-headed. The spirits were not invincible. They were not his true enemies. They were his own fears, his insecurities, manifesting in their darkest form. "I've made mistakes," Jackson said aloud, his voice shaking, but strong. "I failed, but I also learned. I am not perfect, but I will fight. For my crew, for humanity. I will not let the past define me." As his words echoed through the room, something changed. The spirits, once hovering in the corners of his mind, seemed to falter. Their fiery eyes dimmed, their forms flickering like fading shadows. The air in the room seemed to shift as well, lighter, less oppressive. The pressure on his chest eased. He wasn't alone anymore. His crew was with him, and together they had overcome the trial of the heart. But just as the spirits began to dissolve into nothingness, their ethereal forms slipping away like dust in the wind, a new presence made itself known. The throne pulsed with an intense energy, its light flickering like an ancient heart coming to life. The throne wasn't done with them yet. The trial had taken its toll, but now it was ready for the next test. "Your hearts are not enough," the voice echoed, but now it seemed colder, more ominous. "You have faced your past, but the future will be your true trial." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine as the shadows that had retreated now twisted back, their forms warping once again. The trial of the heart had ended, but the throne's power was far from finished. There was something worse ahead, something that would force them to question everything they had fought for, everything they had believed. The room began to change once more. The walls warped, the floor cracked open beneath their feet, and the throne's pulse quickened. A new trial had begun, one that would test the very essence of their future. Jackson knew that the hardest test was still to come. But for now, he had learned something important. It wasn't just about the throne's power. It was about their collective strength, their bond as a crew. And that, perhaps, was the key to surviving the trials ahead. The chamber began to quake violently as the throne pulsed brighter than ever. Its once subdued hum now reverberated with an oppressive power, shaking the very foundation of the room. The air grew thick with static, and the floor beneath them trembled as if the entire structure was alive, breathing in sync with the growing intensity of the throne's pulse. Jackson felt his heart race. They had passed through the trials of unity and the heart, but the throne's final test was far from over. There was no mistaking it now. The future would be the ultimate challenge, one that would not only test their resolve, but their very sense of purpose. The question was clear. Could they survive what was to come, or would they succumb to the darkness that had claimed so many before them? "What is this?" Kira shouted, her voice strained as she gripped Jackson's arm. It's like it's pulling us in." Jackson looked around, feeling a deep sense of dread rising in his chest. The walls of the chamber were now closing in, narrowing toward the throne, as if some invisible force was compressing the space. The shadows that had lingered before were now growing longer, twisting in unnatural shapes, like tendrils of a nightmare reaching out to claim them. "We're running out of time," Dr. Voss said, her voice laced with urgency. "This is the final trial. The throne is testing us not just for who we are, but for what we will become. Our choices, our futures, will be decided here." Jackson's mind raced. What was it asking of them? Was it seeking to shape them into something they weren't, to warp their very essence? The stakes had never been higher. He turned to face his crew, who were struggling to remain grounded amidst the chaos. They had been through so much, each of them pushing themselves beyond their limits. Now their very futures were at stake, and Jackson knew he had to make the hardest decision of all. They couldn't keep going in blind, assuming the throne would yield its secrets without a deeper cost. "I don't know what this trial will ask of us," he said, his voice firm yet filled with uncertainty. "But we need to decide. We need to choose what we want the future to be, not just for us, but for everyone." The throne's pulse intensified, and a powerful wave of energy surged from it, flooding the room with blinding light. Jackson's mind reeled as an image began to form before him, an image of Earth, humanity's homeworld. It was a vision of the past, showing the civilization that had created the throne. A sprawling, towering metropolis filled with people, machines, and advanced technologies beyond anything the crew had ever seen. But then the image shifted. The cities crumbled. The skies turned red with fire. People screamed, running through the streets as the very planet itself seemed to tear itself apart. Jackson's stomach churned as he saw the faces of the people, the ones who had built the throne, fading away into nothingness, their lives erased by their own hubris. It was a horrifying vision of destruction, one that mirrored the worst of humanity's history. "This is what happened to them," Jackson murmured, his voice barely audible. "They thought they could control it, control everything. But in the end, they were destroyed by it." The throne's light flickered, and suddenly the image was replaced by a different vision, one of a bright future, a world where humanity had risen from the ashes, where peace and unity reigned, and where the people had learned from the mistakes of the past. A future where the throne had been used for creation, not destruction, and where humanity's potential was limitless. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. This was the future they had fought for, the one they had hoped was possible. The voice of the throne echoed in his mind, cold and dispassionate. To claim the throne is to shape your destiny. But the path you choose will bind you, for the throne cannot be wielded without sacrifice. Choose wisely. Jackson turned to his crew. The weight of the decision was crushing. They could claim the throne's power, reshape the galaxy, and perhaps even rebuild humanity into something greater than ever before. But at what cost? What would they lose along the way? Kiera stepped forward, her voice unwavering. We have to choose, Jackson, but we have to choose together. No matter what happens, we do this as one. For humanity's future. Her words struck a chord in him. They had come so far together, faced so many challenges. The throne could test them, manipulate them, but it could not destroy their unity. If they were to shape the future, they would do it on their terms, as a team. Jackson turned back to the throne, his resolve hardening. We choose the future, he said, his voice resolute. We choose hope, unity, and the lessons of the past. We won't let the mistakes of those who came before us define who we are. This is our chance to do better, to build something that lasts. The throne's light pulsed, and for a moment it seemed to falter. The oppressive force in the room lifted, and the vision of destruction faded, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. The air cleared, and the walls of the chamber seemed to expand, as if the very space had grown larger. The trial had ended. The throne's power was theirs to command. But Jackson knew that it wasn't just the throne's power that would shape their destiny. It was their will, their hearts, and their unity that would guide them. The crew stood together, battered but resolute. The trials were over, but their journey was far from complete. With the throne's power now in their grasp, they had a choice to make. They could rise above the failures of the past and rebuild humanity into something greater, or they could let the mistakes of the past haunt them forever. As Jackson stood before the throne, he knew one thing for certain. The future was theirs to shape, and together they would forge a destiny that would stand the test of time.